24th October, 1933. The autumn cold gripped London as twin boys entered the world in Hoxton, their cries echoing through the cramped terraced house on Steen Street. Reginald and Ronald Kray arrived 10 minutes apart, yet they would spend the next 35 years inseparable, building an empire of violence and glamour that would transform the East End into their personal kingdom. Their mother, Violet, cradled the infants while their father, Charles Sr., paced nervously outside. The Kray household already included their older brother Charlie, born 6 years earlier. Nobody in that modest dwelling could have imagined that these two red-faced babies would become the most notorious gangsters in British criminal history, their names synonymous with organized crime in post-war London. The twins grew up in a world shaped by poverty and war. The Second World War transformed the East End into a landscape of rubble and opportunity. While German bombs rained down on London's docklands, young Ronnie and Reggie learned their first lessons in survival. The black market flourished in the chaos, and the Kray family, like many others in Bethnal Green, discovered that rules became flexible when survival was at stake. Charles Sr. was often absent, a fact that shaped the twins' upbringing profoundly. He worked as a wardrobe dealer when he worked at all, preferring to avoid the constraints of regular employment or military conscription. Violet became the dominant force in their lives, showering her twins with unconditional love and creating a bond so intense that it would later be analyzed by psychiatrists and criminologists alike. By 1949, when the twins turned 16, their reputation was already forming. They were handsome, charming, and utterly fearless. Boxing became their first legitimate pursuit, and both showed genuine talent in the ring. Reggie, the more naturally gifted athlete, won several amateur bouts at the Robert Browning Institute. Ronnie possessed raw aggression that sometimes worked against him, his punches fueled by an internal rage that even then seemed difficult to control. The billiard halls and cafes of Bethnal Green became their territory. Other teenagers learned quickly not to challenge the Kray twins. They moved as one entity, dressed identically in sharp suits, even when they could barely afford them. Their uncle, who had served time for various offenses, regaled them with stories of legendary East End criminals, planting seeds that would eventually bloom into their criminal empire. National Service called them in 1952, but their military career proved disastrous. The twins had no intention of following orders or accepting authority. They deserted repeatedly, attacked officers, and spent more time in military prison than in actual service. According to records from the British Army archives referenced in John Pearson's comprehensive biography, The Profession of Violence, their disciplinary files grew so thick that the military eventually gave them dishonorable discharges just to be rid of them. Returning to civilian life in 1954, the twins were 21 and ready to build something bigger than boxing matches and street fights. The East End was changing. American culture was seeping into British life, and the twins watched Hollywood gangster films with fascination. They saw themselves as British versions of Al Capone, and the neighborhood seemed ready for someone to take control. The question was no longer if the Kray twins would become criminals, but how far their ambition would take them. 1956 marked the true beginning of the Kray empire. The twins purchased their first legitimate business, a rundown billiard hall on Eric Street in Mile End. They renamed it The Regal and transformed it into their headquarters. The location was strategic, positioned perfectly in the heart of their territory. Local businessmen soon learned that protection money paid to the Krays ensured their shops remained intact, their windows unbroken, their families safe from the random violence that plagued unprotected establishments. The twins developed different but complementary styles. Reggie was the businessman, charming and calculating. He could negotiate with property owners, schmooze with local politicians, and present a respectable face to the outside world. His suits were impeccably tailored, his hair perfectly styled. Women found him attractive, and men wanted to be in his circle. Ronnie was the enforcer, the madman, the one who enjoyed violence for its own sake. His eyes held a peculiar intensity that made people uncomfortable. Where Reggie used threats strategically, Ronnie acted on impulse. He carried his paranoia like a weapon, seeing enemies everywhere and responding with disproportionate brutality. Yet his reputation for unpredictability became an asset. Nobody wanted to test Ronnie Kray's temper. They assembled what became known as the Firm, a collection of enforcers, drivers, and yes-men who carried out the twins' orders without question. Some joined for money, others for protection, many simply because refusing the Krays was more dangerous than working for them. The firm included their older brother Charlie, who handled much of the legitimate business operations, though he never possessed his younger brother's appetite for violence. By 1959, the Krays controlled most of the protection rackets in the East End. They expanded into West End clubs, recognizing that the real money came from the wealthy patrons who frequented Soho's nightlife. They opened the Double R Club in Bow Road, deliberately positioning themselves at the intersection of legitimate nightclub ownership and criminal activity. The club became famous for its glamorous atmosphere. Celebrities began appearing, attracted by the dangerous allure of the Kray mystique. Boxers, actors, and even politicians were photographed with the twins. These images, later published in newspapers and magazines, gave the Krays something more valuable than money: legitimacy. They weren't just criminals, they were East End celebrities. Local boys made good who still bought rounds for their old neighbors. Their move into West End protection brought them into contact with established Maltese and Italian gangs who had controlled Soho for decades. The Krays were audacious, walking into established territories and demanding tribute. Violence erupted regularly. Ronnie, in particular, seemed to relish these confrontations. He carried a Mauser pistol and made sure everyone knew he wasn't afraid to use it. The early 1960s saw the twins at their peak social power. They cultivated relationships with journalists, particularly those who could write favorable profiles. According to documentation from the National Archives, they even had police officers on their payroll, men who would warn them about upcoming raids or investigations. The corruption ran deeper than most Londoners realized, creating a protective web around the twins that seemed impenetrable. They befriended Lord Boothby, a prominent conservative politician, and these connections provided political cover. Photographs of the twins with celebrities and politicians created a public image that contradicted their criminal reality. They positioned themselves as community leaders, men who looked after the East End, who made sure elderly women could walk home safely, who punished those who preyed on the vulnerable. The truth was far darker. Behind the glamorous photographs and charitable gestures existed a criminal enterprise built on fear, violence, and exploitation. But in 1963, as they celebrated their 30th birthday surrounded by celebrities and sycophants, the Kray twins seemed untouchable, their empire expanding, their legend growing with each passing day. 1963 brought complications the twins hadn't anticipated. Ronnie's mental health, always precarious, began deteriorating rapidly. His paranoia intensified, transforming from useful wariness into debilitating psychosis. He heard voices, saw conspiracies everywhere, and his violent outbursts became increasingly unpredictable. His homosexuality, which he made little effort to hide despite the era's severe legal prohibitions, added another layer of complexity to his volatile personality. Reggie watched his twins decline with growing concern. Their connection was so profound that Ronnie's instability affected him too. When Ronnie was hospitalized in March of 1958 for psychiatric treatment, Reggie visited daily, bringing food and comfort. The diagnosis was paranoid schizophrenia, though the medications prescribed did little to control his symptoms. Ronnie refused to stay institutionalized, discharging himself against medical advice, convinced that enemies were trying to weaken him through psychiatric intervention. The twins' relationship with violence evolved during this period. What had begun as strategic enforcement became something darker. Ronnie, in particular, seemed to kill not out of necessity, but from a desire to prove something to himself. He spoke openly about wanting to murder someone, about earning his reputation as truly dangerous. This obsession would have catastrophic consequences. Their criminal empire continued expanding despite Ronnie's instability. They moved into long-firm fraud, a sophisticated scam where they would establish seemingly legitimate businesses, build credit with suppliers, order massive amounts of goods, then vanish with the merchandise and sell it on the black market. The operation required intelligence and planning, skills Reggie possessed in abundance. According to financial records later seized by police and referenced in various court proceedings, these frauds netted them hundreds of thousands of pounds. They also expanded their protection rackets beyond London, moving into Brighton, Cambridge, and other cities. Local criminals either worked with the Krays or found themselves on the receiving end of vicious beatings. The message was clear. The East End was spreading its influence, and resistance was futile. Frances Shay entered Reggie's life during this tumultuous period. She was beautiful, innocent, and completely unsuited for the world Reggie inhabited. Her family lived in the East End, and she had known the Krays since childhood. Reggie pursued her with single-minded determination, seeing in Frances something pure that contrasted with the violence of his daily existence. They married in April of 1965 at St. James's Church in Bethnal Green. The wedding was spectacular, a public display of the Krays' wealth and status. Celebrities attended, photographers captured every moment, and the East End treated it like a royal wedding. Frances wore white, looking ethereal and terrified in equal measure. She was 22 years old and entering a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. The marriage was troubled from the beginning. Reggie's devotion to Ronnie exceeded his commitment to Frances. The twins still lived together much of the time, conducting business until dawn, entertaining criminal associates, and maintaining a lifestyle incompatible with conventional marriage. Frances found herself isolated, depressed, and increasingly desperate to escape. Ronnie's hostility toward Frances was barely concealed. He saw her as competition for Reggie's attention, an intrusion into their twin bond. He made cruel remarks, excluded her from conversations, and created an atmosphere of tension whenever she was present. Frances began suffering anxiety attacks, her mental health collapsing under the strain of being married to a gangster whose primary loyalty was to his twin brother. By 1966, the darkness at the heart of the Kray Empire was becoming impossible to hide. Ronnie's mental illness was worsening. Reggie's marriage was failing. Their criminal activities were drawing increased attention from law enforcement. The glamorous facade was cracking, revealing something rotten underneath. The twins stood at the peak of their power, but the descent had already begun. 9th March, 1966. The Blind Beggar Pub in Whitechapel Road stood quiet in the early evening, its usual patrons nursing pints and playing darts. George Cornell, a member of the rival Richardson gang, sat at the bar, confident in his safety. He had made a critical miscalculation. Ronnie Kray walked through the door with two associates flanking him. The jukebox played "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore" by the Walker Brothers, a detail that would be repeated in countless retellings. Cornell turned, saw Ronnie approaching, and allegedly smiled before saying something dismissive. Ronnie pulled out a 9mm Luger pistol and shot Cornell through the forehead. The gangster collapsed, dying instantly. The few witnesses suddenly remembered they had seen nothing. This murder marked a turning point. Ronnie had achieved his ambition to kill someone publicly, to prove his reputation as the most dangerous man in London. The shooting was audacious, reckless, and entirely characteristic of Ronnie's deteriorating mental state. Reggie was reportedly furious, recognizing that such a public murder would bring intense police scrutiny. The investigation that followed proved ineffective. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. The barmaid claimed she was in the basement changing a barrel when the shooting occurred, though everyone knew she had been behind the bar. The wall of silence that protected the Krays remained intact, reinforced by fear and loyalty in equal measure. Frances Kray's mental health collapsed completely during this period. The combination of her failing marriage, isolation, and the knowledge of the violent world her husband inhabited drove her to despair. She attempted suicide multiple times, each attempt a desperate cry for help that went largely unheeded. Reggie loved her, but his love was insufficient against the overwhelming force of his criminal lifestyle and his bond with Ronnie. On 7th June 1967, Frances was found dead from an overdose of phenobarbital. She was 23 years old. The official verdict was suicide, though questions lingered about whether she had intended to die or simply wanted to escape temporarily into oblivion. Reggie was devastated, his grief genuine and overwhelming. He had the funeral delayed so her body could be preserved, visiting her repeatedly, unable to accept her death. The loss transformed Reggie. Where he had once been the controlled, strategic twin, he now embraced violence with the same enthusiasm as Ronnie. The last restraint on their behavior vanished with Frances. The twins became increasingly reckless, their paranoia feeding on itself, their circle of trust shrinking to almost nothing. Jack McVitie, known as Jack the Hat for his habit of wearing a hat to hide his baldness, became their next victim. McVitie was a low-level criminal, a violent drunk who had failed to carry out a contract killing for the twins and then compounded his mistake by publicly insulting them. Such disrespect could not be tolerated. 28th October, 1967. The twins lured McVitie to a basement flat in Evering Road, Stoke Newington, under the pretense of a party. When McVitie arrived, Reggie was waiting with a gun. He pulled the trigger, but the weapon jammed. What followed was brutal and prolonged. Reggie grabbed a carving knife and stabbed McVitie repeatedly in the face, chest, and stomach, pinning him to the floor while Ronnie held him down. The murder was savage, personal, and utterly unnecessary. They disposed of McVitie's body, which was never recovered. According to various accounts later provided by firm members who turned informant, the body was weighted and dumped in the English Channel, or cremated, or buried in a building foundation. The mystery of Jack the Hat's final resting place remains unsolved. These murders sealed the Krays' fate. Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Red of Scotland Yard had been building a case against the twins for years. The murder investigations provided the leverage he needed. The wall of silence was strong, but Red was patient, methodical, and absolutely determined. The empire the twins had built over 15 years was about to come crashing down around them. 1968 began with the Kray twins still operating freely, but Detective Superintendent Leonard Red was closing in. Red had studied the Krays for years, understanding that conventional investigation techniques wouldn't work. The twins had corrupted too many police officers, intimidated too many witnesses, and built too many layers of protection around themselves. Red needed a different approach. He established a secret headquarters away from Scotland Yard, recognizing that information leaked routinely from the official building. The new operations room was located in Tintagel House, a nondescript office block near Vauxhall Bridge. Here, Red assembled a team of detectives he trusted absolutely, men who couldn't be bribed or intimidated. They began building their case in complete secrecy. The strategy was comprehensive. Reed understood that the Krays' strength came from fear and loyalty within the East End community. He needed to break that fear, to convince people that testifying against the twins wouldn't result in their own deaths. This required simultaneously arresting everyone in the firm, removing their capacity to retaliate against witnesses. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The firm itself was fracturing. The twins' increasing paranoia and violence had alienated many of their longtime associates. Some members began quietly cooperating with police, providing information in exchange for protection and reduced charges. Each piece of intelligence added to Reed's growing case file. The surveillance operation was extensive. Police watched the twins constantly, documenting their movements, photographing their associates, recording conversations where possible. They mapped out the entire criminal organization, identifying every member of the firm, every business connected to the Krays, every location they controlled. The web was vast, but Reed was patient. Ronnie's mental health continued deteriorating throughout this period. His paranoid schizophrenia was now obvious to everyone around him. He required constant medication, which he often refused to take. His violent outbursts became more frequent and more irrational. Some members of the firm began fearing Ronnie more than they feared the police, a dangerous development for the twins. Reggie was drinking heavily, still mourning Francis, and struggling to manage both the criminal empire and his increasingly unstable twin. The glamorous lifestyle they had cultivated was collapsing. The celebrity friends stopped visiting. The politicians distanced themselves. The protective shield of publicity and social connections was disintegrating. Red obtained permission to use witness protection, a relatively new concept in British law enforcement. He could now promise potential witnesses something valuable: safety. Several firm members, facing serious charges themselves, began considering cooperation. The first cracks in the wall of silence were appearing. The twins seemed aware that their time was running out. They became more isolated, trusting fewer people, seeing betrayal everywhere. Ironically, their paranoia, which had once served them well, was now clouding their judgment. They made mistakes, left evidence, and failed to recognize that their empire was crumbling from within. Red worked tirelessly, often sleeping in his office, reviewing statements, coordinating surveillance teams, and building prosecutions for multiple charges. He knew he would only get one chance to arrest the twins. If the evidence was insufficient, if the witnesses recanted, if the prosecution failed, the Krays would be untouchable. Every detail had to be perfect. Financial investigations revealed the extent of the twins' criminal enterprises. The long-firm frauds alone had netted them over £1 million in today's currency. Their protection rackets generated steady income from hundreds of businesses. They had investments in nightclubs, property, and various legitimate ventures that laundered their criminal proceeds. The firm was more sophisticated than many people realized. By early May of 1968, Red was ready. He had statements from witnesses willing to testify. He had forensic evidence linking the twins to multiple crimes. He had mapped out the entire organization and identified locations where key firm members could be found. The operation would be massive, coordinated, and decisive. Detective Superintendent Reed prepared to dismantle the Kray empire in a single morning. 8th May, 1968. Dawn broke over London as police vans moved quietly through the East End streets. Detective Superintendent Red had coordinated the largest organized crime operation in British police history. Over 100 officers participated in simultaneous raids across London, targeting every member of the firm. At 6 o'clock precisely, officers knocked on the door of Bunny's flat in Braithwaite House, Bunny being the nickname of one of the twins' associates, where the Krays were staying. Reggie answered, still in his pajamas. Behind him, Ronnie emerged, looking confused and disheveled. Detective Inspector Frank Cater announced they were under arrest for the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie. The twins were surprisingly compliant during the arrest. Ronnie asked to get dressed properly, selecting one of his expensive suits. Reggie remained calm, perhaps even relieved that the waiting was finally over. They were handcuffed and led to separate police cars. For the first time in their adult lives, the twins were forcibly separated. Simultaneously across London, police arrested 24 members of the firm. The operation was perfectly coordinated. Within hours, the entire criminal organization was in custody. There was nobody left on the streets to intimidate witnesses or organize resistance. Reed's strategy had worked flawlessly. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers that had once published glamorous photographs of the twins now screamed headlines about their arrest. The entire country seemed stunned that the untouchable Kray twins had finally been captured. In the East End, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, relieved to be free from years of intimidation. Others mourned, having genuinely believed the twins were community protectors. The twins were held in separate prisons while awaiting trial. This separation was deliberate. Red understood that the twins' power came partly from their connection to each other. Isolated, they were weaker. Ronnie, in particular, struggled with the separation. His mental health deteriorated rapidly without his twin nearby. Witnesses began coming forward, their testimony protected by the mass arrests that left the firm unable to retaliate. The barmaid from The Blind Beggar, who had previously claimed to see nothing, now provided detailed testimony about Cornell's murder. Members of the firm, facing lengthy sentences themselves, cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. The trial began on 8 January 1969 at the Old Bailey. The charges were extensive: murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to murder, and various other serious crimes. The prosecution, led by Kenneth Jones, presented a devastating case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and financial records that documented the extent of the twins' criminal empire. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists and curious spectators. Security was unprecedented. The defendants sat in a specially constructed dock designed to hold multiple prisoners. The Kray twins were the stars of this dark show, dressed impeccably in their expensive suits, maintaining their composure despite the damning testimony piling up around them. Ronnie Bender, one of their associates, testified about disposing of McVitie's body. Other firm members described the culture of fear the twins had created, the casual violence, the paranoid rage that could erupt over minor perceived slights. The glamorous image carefully constructed over years was systematically dismantled, revealing the ugly reality beneath. The defense attempted to portray the twins as products of their environment, victims of class prejudice, and local heroes who had been unfairly targeted. The strategy failed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The jury heard recordings, saw photographs, and listened to witness after witness describe years of intimidation and violence. On 5 March, 1969, after 6 hours and 54 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on the murder charges. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. The twins showed no emotion, maintaining the stoic facade they had perfected over decades. Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson delivered the sentences. Both twins received life imprisonment with the recommendation that they serve a minimum of 30 years before being eligible for parole. The judge's words were harsh, describing them as dangerous criminals whose reign of terror had scarred East End communities for too long. As they were led from the dock, the twins briefly made eye contact with each other. Their empire, built over 15 years through violence, intimidation, and charisma, had collapsed in less than a year. The East End legends were now simply prisoners, facing the rest of their lives behind bars, their connection to each other severed by prison walls and legal restrictions. 1969 onwards. The twins entered the British prison system as the most famous inmates in the country. Their celebrity followed them behind bars, but the reality of incarceration was harsh and unrelenting. For two men who had lived as kings in their own kingdom, the adjustment to powerlessness proved devastating. They were initially held in separate maximum security prisons, a deliberate policy to prevent them from coordinating any criminal activities or planning escapes. Ronnie was sent to Durham Prison, while Reggie went to Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. The separation was agonizing for both twins, but particularly destructive for Ronnie, whose mental health had always been precarious. Ronnie's paranoid schizophrenia worsened dramatically in prison. The institutional environment, the forced separation from Reggie, and the loss of control over his circumstances triggered severe episodes. He was eventually transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Berkshire, in 1979. This would be his home for the rest of his life. At Broadmoor, Ronnie became a strange figure, simultaneously pathetic and still somewhat menacing. He held court with visitors, gave interviews to journalists, and maintained connections with the criminal underworld through correspondence. He married twice while incarcerated, both ceremonies conducted within the hospital grounds. His husbands were young men attracted by his notoriety, relationships that raised questions about exploitation and genuine affection in equal measure. Reggie adapted differently to prison life. He was a model prisoner in many respects, obeying rules, causing no trouble, and pursuing various educational and rehabilitative programs. He studied law, took art classes, and wrote extensively, including poetry that revealed a contemplative, even melancholic side that the public had never seen. His letters, later published in various collections, showed genuine remorse for some of his actions, particularly Frances's death. He wrote repeatedly about his late wife, expressing guilt for the pain he had caused her and the circumstances that led to her suicide. These expressions seemed authentic, suggesting that decades of reflection had given Reggie some self-awareness that had been absent during his criminal career. The twins continued to generate public interest throughout their incarceration. Books were written about them, documentaries produced, and their legend somehow grew even as they languished in prison. The 1980s and 90s saw a strange rehabilitation of their public image, with some portraying them as romantic anti-heroes, working-class boys who challenged the establishment. This romanticization infuriated many, particularly victims of their violence and families destroyed by their criminal activities. The reality of the Kray twins was not romantic. They had terrorized communities, ruined lives, and murdered at least 2 people, possibly more. The glamorous image had always been a carefully constructed lie. Reggie applied for parole repeatedly, always denied. The Home Office position remained consistent. The twins had been extraordinarily dangerous criminals whose early release would send an unacceptable message. The minimum 30-year sentence was exactly that, a minimum, not a guarantee. The brothers were occasionally allowed supervised visits with each other, meetings that were carefully monitored and strictly limited. These reunions were emotional, the twins clinging to each other, their connection undiminished by decades of separation. They remained each other's primary relationship, the bond formed in Violet's womb still stronger than any other connection in their lives. Violet, their mother, remained devoted until her death in 1982. She visited regularly, bringing food and comfort, never accepting that her beloved boys were dangerous criminals. Her death hit both twins hard, removing the last connection to their childhood, and the woman who had loved them unconditionally despite everything. Charlie Kray, their older brother, was released after serving 7 years for his role in the firm. He attempted to live quietly, but struggled with the notoriety attached to the Kray name. He was convicted again in 1997 for drug trafficking and died in prison in 2000, never fully escaping the shadow of his younger brothers. The media continued profiting from the Kray story. Films dramatized their lives, often glossing over the violence and emphasizing the glamorous aspects. The 1990 film, The Krays, starring Gary and Martin Kemp, portrayed them sympathetically, focusing on their devotion to their mother and their twin bond while minimizing their victims. By the late 1990s, both twins were elderly men, their health deteriorating, their dangerous days long past. The question of whether they deserved compassion or continued punishment divided public opinion. Some argued they had served sufficient time and should be released on humanitarian grounds. Others insisted they should die in custody, paying the full price for their crimes. 17th March, 1995. Ronnie Kray collapsed in his room at Broadmoor Hospital while watching television. He was 61 years old and had been suffering from heart disease for several years. Attempts to revive him failed. The man who had once terrorized London died quietly in a psychiatric hospital, his twin brother unable to be at his side. The funeral became a spectacle that revealed how completely the Kray legend had overtaken reality. Thousands lined the streets of Bethnal Green as the funeral procession passed. The hearse was drawn by 6 black horses, flanked by limousines carrying flowers and mourners. Celebrities attended, photographers swarmed, and the media treated it like a state funeral for a fallen hero rather than the burial of a murderer. Reggie was allowed to attend the funeral under heavy guard. Handcuffed and surrounded by prison officers, he said goodbye to his twin for the last time. The separation that had begun with their arrest 27 years earlier was now permanent and final. Reggie's grief was profound and public, his face a mask of anguish as Ronnie's coffin was lowered into the ground. After Ronnie's death, Reggie's health declined rapidly. He had been diagnosed with bladder cancer in 1997, and the disease progressed aggressively. He continued applying for compassionate release, arguing that he deserved to die free after serving over 30 years. The applications were consistently denied. In August of 2000, with Reggie's condition deteriorating and death imminent, Home Secretary Jack Straw finally granted compassionate release. Reggie was freed on 26 August 2000, having served 32 years in prison. He was 66 years old, suffering from terminal cancer, and had only weeks to live. His release sparked controversy. Victims' families protested that a murderer was being shown mercy he had never extended to others. Supporters argued that allowing a dying man dignity in his final days was simply humane. The debate revealed how divisive the Kray legacy remained, even at the very end. Reggie spent his final weeks at a hotel in Norwich, cared for by friends and his second wife, Roberta, whom he had married while in prison. He gave a final interview expressing regret for his crimes and the pain he had caused, though some questioned whether this remorse was genuine or performed for public consumption. 1st October, 2000. Reggie Kray died in his sleep at a Norwich hotel. He was 66 years old. The twin who had survived longest had finally succumbed, ending the story that had begun 67 years earlier in a Hoxton terraced house. His funeral, held on 11th October 2000, was another massive public event. Thousands attended, celebrities sent flowers, and the media extensively covered every detail. The funeral route passed through the East End, allowing the community that had been both terrorized and fascinated by the twins to say a final goodbye. Reggie was buried next to Ronnie in Chingford Mount Cemetery, the twins reunited in death as they had been inseparable in life. The Kray legacy remains deeply controversial. Academic studies, including research referenced in Dick Hobbs's sociological work on East End crime, published by Oxford University Press, have analyzed how the twins represented a specific moment in British criminal history. when organized crime was transitioning from small-scale local operations to more sophisticated international networks. They were simultaneously products of their environment and exceptional criminals whose personalities and circumstances created something unique. The poverty of the East End, the disruption of World War II, the absence of their father, the overpowering devotion of their mother, Ronnie's mental illness, and their twin bond, all contributed to creating two of Britain's most notorious criminals. The romanticization of their story continues to trouble those who understand the reality of their crimes. They were not Robin Hood figures protecting the poor. They were violent gangsters who built an empire through intimidation, murder, and exploitation. Their victims deserve remembrance as much as the twins themselves. The East End has changed dramatically since the Kray era. Gentrification has transformed Bethnal Green and Whitechapel into expensive neighborhoods bearing little resemblance to the working-class community the twins once controlled. The Double R Club is long gone. The streets they walked are unrecognizable, and the world that created them has vanished. Yet their story endures, retold in films, books, and documentaries. The Kray twins remain the most famous British criminals of the 20th century, their names synonymous with organized crime. Whether they deserve this enduring fame or should instead be forgotten as violent murderers remains an open question. What is certain is that Reginald and Ronald Kray, born 10 minutes apart on 24 October 1933, left an indelible mark on British criminal history. They rose from poverty to build a criminal empire, lived as celebrities while terrorizing communities, and ultimately paid for their crimes with their freedom and their lives. The East End legends were real, but the reality was far darker and more complicated than the legend suggests.